Good morning, and welcome to the morning from the New York Times. I'm glad you're here. Today is Saturday, June 21st, 2026, the first full day of summer. We've got a lot to get through today: nuclear talks in Switzerland, protests in Albania, a debate over a deadly drug, World Cup drama, a new podcast from the Serial Team, and an interview with Danny McBride. But we're going to start somewhere a little more personal, with food, and the two critics who spend their lives thinking about it. Let's begin with a conversation that's been a long time coming. Almost exactly a year ago, the New York Times introduced us to its two new chief restaurant critics, Tejal Rao and Ligaya Mizhan. These are two writers who have spent the past 12 months doing something most of us can only dream about: eating, professionally, all across the country and all over New York City. The Times recently sat down with both of them separately, and today we're getting the highlights from both conversations woven together. So, what were the standout moments from this first year? For Tejal Rao, it was Texas barbecue. Specifically Barb's BQ in Lockhart. And if you know Texas barbecue culture, you know Lockhart is kind of the holy city of the form, so to single out one spot there is really saying something. She also raved about every meal at a place called Diane's in Minneapolis, especially, and this is a beautiful detail, chicken soup for breakfast. And then there was the tasting menu at Emeril's in New Orleans, which she says totally surprised her. She said it reminded her that tasting menus can actually be fun, which is not something you hear every day. For Ligaya Mizhan, the year has been defined by one enormous project: completing the top 100 restaurants list for New York City. She described it as running a marathon. There were days she ate at 5 restaurants in a single day. Sometimes the subway ride to a restaurant was longer than the meal itself. Just think about that for a second: you're on the subway for 40 minutes, you sit down, you eat, you take notes, and you're back on the train. That's the job. Now, here's something practical for anyone who's ever tried to get into a hot restaurant in New York. Both critics have tips, and neither of them cuts the line. Tejal's advice? Go at terrible times. Very early. Very late. And if they take walk-ins, just show up and be willing to wait. She acknowledged nobody wants to hear that, but there it is. Ligaya's approach is more systematic, and honestly a little exhausting to hear about. She sets multiple alarms for when reservations drop. She works the apps on both mobile and desktop simultaneously. She's discovered that if you keep refreshing in that first hour after reservations open, time slots will disappear and then pop back up, because a lot of restaurants now require full payment up front, and people back out. So the inventory is constantly shifting. Filing that away. The critics also read a lot while dining alone, which is a lovely image: a restaurant critic with a book propped open, and both had a book that stayed with them this year. Tejal just finished The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny by Kiran Desai. She said the characters are still with her, that it was such an immersive experience she sometimes forgot where she was and what she was supposed to be doing. High praise. Ligaya read Spring Snow by Yukio Mishima, which she described as full of the quiet violence of emotions in a very buttoned-up society. Two very different books. Two very different readers. At home, Ligaya's happiest meals are simple: vegetables and rice, cooked by her husband, who she calls, without hesitation, the best chef in the city. She talks about the way he roasts carrots and eggplant like it's some kind of religious experience. Tejal's home cooking is shaped by life with a toddler: a stack of crisp nori, hot rice, a little protein, everyone's favorite condiments. Easy and beloved by the whole family. Though she admits that after any trip, what she truly craves is a good salad. And then, the most embarrassing thing each has eaten in the past year. Tejal's answer is deeply relatable to any parent: the humiliating meals of someone eating what their child leaves behind. A dried out quarter of a PB&J, half a squished apricot. A bit of cold chicken that may or may not have been chewed on already. Quote, who can say? Ligaya, on the other hand, has a confession of a different kind. When she's stuck at her desk writing, she eats yasso bars, those frozen yogurt bars. Sometimes for a day, if the writing's not going well. The interview wraps up with a rapid-fire round that reveals a lot. Do they order dessert when dining out for fun? Tejal, yes. Ligaya, 100%. Butter or olive oil? Tejal is butter. Ligaya is olive oil. Sweet or salty? Tejal, salty. Ligaya, both at once. There's your preview of the two people shaping how the paper of record thinks about restaurants in America. You can read the full conversation on the Times website. Now let's turn to the news, and we start in Switzerland, where something significant is happening this morning. American and Iranian delegations have arrived for a new round of nuclear talks. This is a direct continuation of the diplomatic effort to address the status of Iran's nuclear program, and the timing matters enormously. There's an active conflict reshaping the Middle East, and the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically critical waterways in the world, has been at the center of it. Here's what happened just yesterday. The U.S. announced that 55 commercial ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz, the largest number to cross in a single day since early in the war. That's a significant data point. The strait is the narrow passage through which a huge portion of the world's oil supply flows, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. When it's free and open, global energy markets breathe easier. When it's threatened, prices and anxieties spike. Iran, however, later announced it was closing the strait again. So in the span of one day, we went from a record number of commercial ships passing through to a renewed closure. That whipsaw dynamic opening, then closing, then the prospect of new talks, captures exactly how volatile this situation remains. And then there's Lebanon. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah is still ongoing, and the Times notes that it's threatening broader peace efforts. Any diplomatic progress on Iran's nuclear program has to contend with the reality that the region remains deeply unstable. These threads are all connected: nuclear diplomacy, maritime access, the fighting in Lebanon, and the Switzerland talks are happening in the middle of all of it. Back home in Washington, a couple of domestic political stories caught our attention this week. First, President Trump said that the newly renovated Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool would likely need to be drained for repairs, and he's attributing the problems to vandalism. The reflecting pool, of course, is one of the most iconic spots on the National Mall, that long, still stretch of water that mirrors both the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. It was recently renovated, so the news that it may already need additional work and draining is drawing attention. The other story is one of those unexpected conflicts that feels very particular to this moment in American politics. A Roman Catholic diocese in New Mexico is fighting with the Trump administration over a proposed section of border wall that could cut off access to a giant statue of Jesus. The diocese argues that the wall, as currently proposed, would block the path to this significant religious site. It's a collision between immigration enforcement priorities and religious access rights, playing out in the desert Southwest. Let's go around the world now, starting in Albania. There are protests in Albania right now, and while they look on the surface like they might be connected to the involvement of Jared Kushner, the former president's son-in-law, in a development project there, participants say the protests are actually about something else entirely: local politics. The Kushner connection set off the initial controversy, but the people in the streets are expressing grievances that are more deeply rooted in Albanian domestic concerns. It's a reminder that international headlines don't always capture what's actually motivating people on the ground. And then there's a story out of Pakistan that is deeply troubling. A court has sentenced the father and an uncle of a 14-year-old girl from New York to life imprisonment for her killing. The father told investigators that her clothing choices, her lifestyle, and her social relationships had brought shame to his family. This was a child, 14 years old, from New York, and she was killed by her own family members over the way she chose to live. The sentences are life imprisonment, and the case has drawn significant attention both in the United States and internationally. A few other big stories before we move on. The Times did something ambitious this week. They asked scholars across America to identify historical figures who shaped the country and whose legacies remain actively debated today. The result is a piece about 8 such figures. It's the kind of history exercise that's genuinely useful, not hagiography, not demolition, but honest reckoning with complicated legacies. The Times has made that link free, so anyone can read it. And in a story that is equal parts absurd and entirely logical once you think about it, there is a cottage cheese shortage, and a TikTok trend promoting the benefits of protein is a significant factor. Cottage cheese has been having a cultural moment. It's protein-dense, it's versatile, it keeps well, and apparently enough people have been influenced by what they're seeing on their phones that demand has genuinely outstripped supply. The dairy industry is trying to catch up. Now to what the Times is calling the Sunday debate, and this one is genuinely important. A Times investigation revealed how the industry around kratom, a drug sold at convenience stores, gas stations, and supplement shops, has benefited from close ties to the Trump administration. And the underlying facts here are alarming. Between 2020 and 2024, nearly 5,300 people died from overdoses involving kratom. That's not a fringe number. That's a public health statistic that would command serious attention if it were attributed to almost any other substance. So the debate the Times is presenting is, should the government ban kratom? The case for banning it comes from Kevin Sabet, writing in the Washington Examiner. His argument is direct: kratom is a dangerous drug, the government has known about the problem for years, and it has failed to act. He points to those overdose numbers, nearly 5,300 deaths in 4 years, and notes that the victims range from celebrities to teenagers. The regulatory failure, in his view, has cost lives. The case against a ban comes from Brian Mock, writing in the Dayton Daily News. His argument draws on the lessons of the broader war on drugs. Banning substances tends to drive them underground, where they become more dangerous, not less. He argues that criminalizing kratom users would do little to address addiction. In fact, he writes, the trauma of incarceration often worsens substance use and leaves lasting scars on families and communities. His position is that kratom should be regulated, not banned. This is a real tension that runs through American drug policy debates again and again: prohibition versus regulation, and which approach actually protects people better. Given the death toll, and the political connections the Times investigation revealed, this debate seems likely to intensify. From the opinion section, a few pieces worth knowing about. There's a personal essay from Zach Ellams, a trans dad who worried about how his identity would affect his relationship with his daughter. What he found was that his identity wasn't complicated for her at all, she just saw her dad. It's a story about the gap between adult anxiety and childhood acceptance, and by many accounts it's quite moving. Jeff Collar writes about medical research, making the case that breakthroughs can already take years to materialize, and that the current administration is dismantling the funding system that makes those breakthroughs possible. The timing and scale of cuts to research infrastructure, he argues, could have consequences that play out over decades. And Jamel Bouie has a column on why President Trump talks so much about voter fraud. The Times has made that one free as well. Now to the World Cup, and there has been a lot of soccer to talk about this week. Germany is looking sharp, and a big reason why is Deniz Undav. After coming off the bench to score in Germany's opening match, he added 2 more goals against Ivory Coast. 2 goals as a sub in one game is exceptional. He's making a very compelling case that he belongs in the starting lineup and can be a genuine scorer for this team. There was a remarkable moment for Curaçao, the small Caribbean island nation, which earned its first ever World Cup point with a draw against Ecuador. The hero was goalkeeper Eloy Room, who made 15 saves. 15. In a single match. The Times reports he may have tied the record held by U.S. goalkeeper legend Tim Howard. For a tiny nation playing in its first World Cup, this is the kind of moment that defines a generation of fans. The Netherlands beat Sweden 5-1, which is a dominant scoreline, though the Times notes that the match was actually tactically interesting despite how the final score looked. Sometimes a blowout conceals a more complex story on the pitch, and apparently this was one of those cases. Japan had a historic day. They scored 4 goals against Tunisia, a 4-0 win, and those 4 goals are the most ever scored by an Asian team in a single World Cup match. That's a record worth celebrating. And there's a lovely feature about a tiny private school in New Jersey that has hosted World Cup teams for decades. The Times made that one free too, and it's the kind of quiet, human story that the tournament tends to produce. From the world of podcasting, there's a new show from the Serial team that we want to tell you about. Serial, if you need a reminder, essentially defined the true crime podcast genre when it launched in 2014. It made millions of people suddenly interested in the details of a single murder case, and it changed what podcasting could be. So when the Serial team puts out something new, it's worth paying attention. The new show is called The Last 12 Weeks, and it does something interesting with the conventions of the true crime genre. Rather than focusing on the crime itself or the convicted person's claims of innocence, it focuses on the lawyers, specifically the habeas lawyers. These are the attorneys who spend years, sometimes decades, fighting to spare clients from execution. The habeas process is the last legal avenue for death row inmates, and the lawyers who work it operate in a specific, high-stakes world that most people never see. The show profiles 2 of these lawyers, and they could not be more different. One is described as a profanity-spewing cowboy. The other is austere and disciplined, eating plain turkey and cheese sandwiches in a motel room as he waits to hear from a court. The case at the center of the series involves a man known as the Desert Killer, a convicted serial killer whose lawyers are fighting to clear him. And the Times says you genuinely cannot predict the outcome until the very end of the 5th and final episode. The whole 5-episode series is available now. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or directly from the Serial website. Finally, this morning, we have an interview with Danny McBride, the actor and writer best known for creating and starring in Eastbound and Down and The Righteous Gemstones. Both shows feature versions of the same kind of character: wounded, vulgar, deluded, and somehow deeply lovable. McBride has made a career out of that type. Now he's published his first collection of short stories, called Thrilling Tales of Modern Men. And the interview, conducted by Times writer David Marchese, gets at what ties everything together in McBride's work: characters who are struggling to find meaning and purpose. Men who feel emasculated, or anxious about their status, or simply adrift. When Marchese asks where McBride thinks people find meaning and purpose, the answer is personal and a little unexpected. McBride talks about growing up going to church. His mom was a puppet minister. She bought puppets, wrote plays, performed children's sermons during Sunday services. The family would load the stage and the puppets into the car and go to church early to help her set up. And then his parents got divorced when he was in 6th grade, and just like that, church wasn't part of their lives anymore. Now McBride has kids of his own, and church isn't part of their lives either. And he started to think, there are basic moral values, basic things about how to live, that he absorbed in that little Baptist church in Spotsylvania, Virginia. And he's been taking for granted that his children will just pick those things up from the world around them. But they won't, necessarily. Someone has to teach them. That's the question he's sitting with. There's also a wonderful moment in the interview where Marchese, a little uncertain, says he wasn't really aware that puppet ministry was a thing. McBride responds, "You seem like you'd be really into puppet ministry." "I actually like puppet ministry, but I mean puppets of the band Ministry." And then he laughs. Classic McBride. He still has the puppets his mom used. He kept them for years, not knowing what to do with them. And he says the idea of them sitting in a dumpster somewhere is heartbreaking. Which tells you something about who this guy actually is underneath all the vulgarity and bravado of his characters. The full interview is available on the Times website, and they've made it free for this weekend. That is the morning for Saturday, June 21st, 2026. Thank you for spending part of your weekend with us. Whether you're planning a summer meal, watching a World Cup match, or just trying to get a reservation somewhere worth going, we hope you have a good one. We'll be back tomorrow.